So I want to welcome you to the October Best Practices Call. We have special presentations today from two National Park Service programs. One, a newer program, the African American Civil Rights Network, which is a comparable, kind of similar network to that we presented on the Underground Railroad in September, but different time period with the Civil Rights Network. And it is a newer program, so it's growing. And Portia will share how to join and how that's growing and new logos and all the work that she's doing. And Madeline will share about the grant program, which is also a Park Service program, but they are different programs. The African American Civil Rights Grant Program is in our State Tribal Local Plans and Grants Division. But of course, we are all colleagues and work closely together, so they can share how that works. So I will remind you that the call is being recorded so that we can share it with those who weren't able to join us at this time. So Madeline, why don't you get us started? Madeline, she was there. Did we lose her? If we lost Madeline, then we could. Okay. How about instead of that, Dan, would you like to talk about your experience with the grant program, and then hopefully I'll get in touch with Madeline and see what happened to her.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd be happy.
Bolognani, go ahead.
Yeah. Let's see. You give me a sharing screen. Yeah. So I'll give you a really brief overview. We were the conduit for two African American civil rights grants for one of the projects that we've been supporting since in inception. It's the restoration of the historic Clinton AME Zion Church in Great Barrington. And I'm sharing my screen now. Hopefully you can see a picture of the Clinton Church there. And just overall, it was my first experience with an African-American civil rights grant through the State Tribal Local Plans and Grants Division. And so it's a little bit of a learning curve for me, and I'll explain why in just a moment or two. But this project here, what you see before you is it's listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and it isn't the oldest Black church in Berkshire County, but it's the longest serving Black church in Berkshire County. And so it has many distinguishing features. It's not a rich or wealthy build out by any means, and that's the way it was in the 1880s. It was a relatively poor congregation that scraped together the funds to put this church together. And interestingly enough, at about the same time this was built, about 10 miles away, is an almost identical structure, again, a church, we surmise was built by the same architect using the same plans, just a little bit more fancy because it wasn't for the African-American community. It was probably a more wealthy white community that pulled that church together. And so it's a very interesting paradox when you look at the two churches, like photos of them side by side. They're very clearly built from the same plans. But this one here, in fact, you can note from the belfry, they could never afford to put a bell in the tower. And so it's never had a bell. It just simply wasn't in the budget. And there are some other features of the church that, some of the more ornate, minute, woodworking, carvings and whatnot that were never added to this church that you see on the other church. So, but it is listed on the National Register. But so we supported this project right from the beginning, and had the good fortune to apply for and were awarded 2 African-American civil rights grants. But let me explain my experience, because as I said, it was a learning curve for us to administer the federal grants. A few things that we had to learn quickly: CFR 200, and that's the Code of Federal Regulations. And that, and you feel free to look it up if you haven't been exposed to it previously, that's the Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for Federal Awards. And it gives you a lot of details about contracting and finances and reporting, et cetera. So CFR 200 is really like the Bible on administering federal grants. Secondly, Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. Whenever you're working with federal money, of course, Section 106 is that requirement that federal agencies consider any effects on historic properties when they're either involved in or funding work on a historic property. And so being familiar with Section 106 rules, also extremely helpful. Fortunately, I had some experience there prior to working on this project. And then the other section, there's sort of a learning curve, Secretary of Interior Standards for Rehabilitations. And again, guidelines for rehabilitating historic buildings, especially when you have federal money involved. Looking at the Secretary of Interior Standards and understanding how they govern what you do to rehabilitate historic buildings. So those three things, CFR 200, Section 106, and the Secretary Standards, those all, one way or another really gave us a pretty good run for our money about learning and figuring out how to deal with them. But I think we've been successful. But let me tell you quickly about the church and why we acted on its behalf to secure these grants. As I mentioned, it is listed on the National Register, and for a couple of reasons. One is its architecture, typical wood frame, wood shingled building. It did originally have a cedar, wood shake roof on it. Subsequently was asphalt shingled over, but we're going to have to restore it back to its original cedar wood shingle roofing, which is a challenge all in its own. And the other distinguishing feature was its social aspect, in that it was the center for activism for the Black community in southern Berkshire County. And in particular, one of the young men who grew up in Great Barrington, was born and raised here, W.E.B. Du Bois, who went on to be widely acclaimed as the architect of the modern civil rights movement, inspired people to carry on their work, like Martin Luther King Jr., for instance, who came after him. But Du Bois was born and raised here. He didn't actually attend this church as a parishioner. He actually went to a different church, but he covered the activities here. He's actually a news reporter for a Philadelphia paper for a period of time, and he used to sit in on the social gatherings here and report on what was going on there. And we believe that it was this extraordinary setting, not only being in Great Barrington, a northern white town that was, for all intents and purposes, free and relatively tolerant, racially speaking, but also that he was exposed to activism that was happening here at the Clinton Church. And so this, on an impressionable young man, I guess, was... On the Gulf Coast, the U.S. South. Oh, somebody's...
Somebody's listening to the news. If everyone could remember to mute themselves.
Here's the breaking it down, that 13 million number. Obviously, you can see.
But for those who don't know Du Bois, he was a co-founder of the NAACP, for instance, the first African-American to earn a PhD from Harvard, writer, activist throughout his life, a very, very accomplished civil and social rights activist in his own right. But this is kind of where it all started for him, at this little church in Great Barrington. But that's a picture of the church while it was still in use, active, with an active congregation. And here's Du Bois and just a little bit about him. But anyway, that was part of the National Register listing, is its social relevance, and in particular about Du Bois. One thing about the Clinton Church is that it's part of a much bigger story about African Americans in the region. And the Upper Housatonic Valley National Heritage Area, our organization, of course, one of the very first projects that we embarked on was to create the African American Heritage Trail here in the region. And the Clinton Church always figured very, very prominently into that thematic trail. As an outgrowth of that, we partnered with, sorry, I went too far here. We partnered with the University of Massachusetts, a number of other organizations and individuals in the region, and created an interpretive plan around African Americans, around Du Bois, and around life in the small town of Great Barrington. And that's a remarkable document. It's now about 12 years old and it's still being implemented. But if you ever are interested, it's online and it's a remarkable piece of work. The church itself served a congregation for over 125 years. But in 2013, the congregation had dwindled to the point where the conference, the AME conference that owns the church, decided to deconsecrate it and move that congregation to other nearby churches. And this is what the church looked like at the time it went up for sale, unfortunately, in 2015. So it sat empty for a little over a year, finally went on the market. And as you can see, in just that couple of years' time, it started to deteriorate very quickly. And it was at that point that a bunch of local citizens thought that they should get together to save this historic structure. And here's a very brief timeline there along the side. They, this local group of citizens got together. They approached the Upper Housatonic Valley Heritage Area and asked if we might be the fiscal agent, if we might be able to support their efforts to buy and restore this church. They first asked us if we could buy the church and restore it, and my board said absolutely not. It would be well beyond our ability to do, and we didn't think it would be that appropriate. But we did resolve to support a grassroots effort to start the fundraising and to actually undertake this massive project. This restoration project is going to easily run into the millions of dollars, but we did stay involved. Once the church was deconsecrated, went on the market, this local group decided that they wanted to start raising money. Our organization, Housatonic Heritage, said that we would be their fiscal agent. We would act as their back office, as their 501c3, so that they could get their feet under them and to do the real job of fundraising, getting public buy-in, and doing some of the essential work that needs to be done to tackle a project of this scope. And so they formed the Clinton Church Restoration Organization. Very quickly went from nothing to raising $100,000 to buy the structure, create their own 501c3 organization. And at that point, we as the National Heritage Area turn the remainder of funds over to them. I continue to sit on the board as an ex officio member to be able to still provide guidance and act as a conduit for federal resources through the National Park Service. So I still do sit on the board, and it was that relationship that allowed me to then, on their behalf, to apply for these 2 African American civil rights grants. One big thing that we did to help them, this is actually, you may recall, many of you National Heritage Areas, that we, through a technical assistance grant from the National Park Service, had engaged Partners for Sacred Places to do some public outreach, some survey work, some work with local organizations to re-envision how sacred structures might be reinvented. And so we, the National Heritage Area here, were able to bring this planning grant to the Clinton Church restoration. And so in October of 2017, we actually undertook that process with partners. And that again was such a boost for the Clinton Church Restoration Group. As I mentioned, we secured 2 African American civil rights grants. One is a preservation grant for about $389,000. So a substantial kickstart for this project. They had been raising money. They raised enough private money to actually buy the structure and to begin some of the important work like creating a historic structures report and garnering broad public support for the project, securing the support of the municipality. But to have a National Park Service grant come to bear on this project was very big for them. It was a really great announcement because it then caught the attention of other potential funders. And I think they continue to appreciate how much having an NPS grant means to this local project, because it gives it, legitimacy, it gives it validity, and, notwithstanding, of course, it paid a lot of bills to get this project moving. So that was one grant. The other grant, this was a preservation grant to actually get, the architectural work done to address a lot of the construction, the rehabilitation issues of the structure itself. The other grant was interpretive planning grant, and that was for $50,000, and that we are just getting underway with now by hiring an organization who can guide us through developing an interpretive plan, designing some of the museum style exhibits, helping us plan the interior of the building, different rooms and etc. And so that part's just getting underway. But again, just to speak to the experience of working with an African American civil rights grant, I just want to make a couple of quick points here. The preservation grant for $389,000, that was for things like roof replacement and drainage systems, mold remediation, stabilizing the belfry, which was starting to detach from the building, accessibility issues, ADA accessibility issues, working on the exterior of the building, which, as you saw from the pictures, the clapboards were starting to rot because of infiltration of water because the roof was failing. And so all of that work was being paid or started with this African American Civil Rights Grant. We subsequently uncovered way more water damage than we had first anticipated. And this was part of our experience of working with the grants administrators, is that once that grant was awarded, we had to go back and have it amended, first of all, because COVID hit. And so we asked if we could have the date, the deliverables date, the end of the grant pushed back, which they were happy to do. We then went back when we found this additional water damage and said, well, some of the work we thought we could do with the money now has to go toward re-engineering and shoring up the south wall, for instance, which was completely rotted away, but we didn't know it at the time. And so they helped us redo the entire budget. So working with the grants administrator on all of these changes was such a breeze. I can't say enough good things about the administrators of the grant program and how they were able to help us, navigate the modifications to the grant. And so we modified statement of work, we modified the budget at another time, and one more modification, clarification of the scope of work that we were able to get. And each time we asked for a modification, they helped us work through and explained, how to get it done, what paperwork they needed to be able to see in order to create the grant modification. And so that part it was wondrous to work with the grant administrators through that piece of it. One big thing that we did with this preservation grant is that we sub-awarded it to the Clinton Church Restoration nonprofit group. And so again, the grant administrator at the National Park Service worked with us as we created an agreement to act as a pass-through for these federal funds directly to the organization that owns the building. And the reason why we did this is that most of that money was going to be combined with other sources of funding to then hire contractors. And in order for them to be able to hire contractors, either design or construction, restoration, etc., they needed to have the money in hand. Otherwise, we would then, if we weren't able to sub-award the funding to the Clinton Church Restoration, that would mean then that the National Heritage Area would also have to be a party to the contract. And this really, really streamlined our ability to work with the Park Service on one side, with the Clinton Church Restoration Group on the other side, and act as a pass-through for those funds. Now, the Clinton Church Restoration people are responsible for doing all of the aforementioned Section 106 compliance, understanding and adhering to the principles in CFR 200, and then helping us develop reports back to the National Park Service. So we really relied on being as the middleman of getting the funds through the National Park Service and then re-granting them to the Clinton Church Restoration, that we had a good partnership there and that we could trust them. And we actually, had a really good agreement with them to assist, because as the primary grantee, the National Heritage Area is not off the hook for making sure that the funds are spent properly and that the reports are in and accurate and on time and all of that good thing. So, and again, the grants administrators at the National Park Service were so gracious in assisting us with developing the sub-award agreement with Clinton Church Restoration. And I think the entire process has gone swimmingly well.
Well, that's great.
And that's all I have. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Dan. And one of those grant administrators is Madeline, and she's back on with us. And so Madeline Kuntz, take it away.
Yeah.
I am sorry for the technical difficulty there. For a minute, my battery ran out, so my computer died. But I'll get started. And I just want to thank you, Dan, very much for your compliments on our staff. We do try to do a good job. There we go. It's so nice to hear about your experience from that back end, because we don't always hear that, and I'd like to know who your administrator was so I can pass along your compliments.
It was Ginger Carter, and unfortunately she moved on.
I know.
She was amazing.
She's the best.
But Seth Tinkham actually, he stopped over at the project while we were just getting the restoration underway. So we met him, but I haven't had a chance to talk to him since. But he was quite supportive as well.
Okay. Well, just a brief overview. I thought I would just start and talk to you about where the money comes from, because it's really an important part of the Civil Rights Grants Program. As you're all familiar with the National Historic Preservation Act, it created several things. And as it was amended in 1977, it established the the Historic Preservation Fund. So that's where all the funds come from the Civil Rights Program. It supplies money to the SHPOs and the TIPOs. I'm sure you're all familiar with the states and the tribes who get money for their historic preservation programs. But Congress appropriates this money every year. But they also appropriate money for our competitive programs. Now, all this funding comes from National Shore Off Drilling. So it isn't taxpayer money per se. So I've listed here several of the competitive programs that we're currently being funded through Congress right now. And as you can see, the AAHC grants are on the top there, but we also have Historic Black Colleges and Universities grants and our newer program, which is the Paul Broom sub-grant revitalization grants for rural properties. And then we got Saving America's Treasures back as well. That had not been funded for several years, since 1910. And we got those this year.
Hey, Madeline?
Yeah.
It's Liz. I think the slideshow that we're seeing, or the slide that we're seeing, I don't think matches up with the one you are talking about.
Are you seeing?
We're seeing what is
Slide 5.
Yeah.
Instead of slide 1.
You're seeing slide 1?
Slide 5 instead of slide 1. Go to slideshow.
Try it again.
There you go.
Yeah, but if I open, well, I'll just do it this way in case the full screen isn't working or something. Anyway, here are our grant programs, as I was talking about. We also have the disaster programs, which are supplemental grants to states for hurricanes, so far hurricanes that Congress has appropriated. Okay, can you see the next slide? Okay, so the African American Civil Rights grants. These grants are to document, interpret, and preserve sites and stories related to the African American Civil Rights Movement and sites of the transatlantic slave trade. There's no match required. These projects are for preservation and history. As Dan had mentioned, there's preservation projects, which are development and construction projects and repair projects. And then there are history projects, which we combine oral histories, exhibits, and different types. We'll go through those a little bit later. The people that are eligible to apply include the states, tribes, CLGs, and then nonprofit organizations. So. It started in 2016 and we've been getting money. We've been very lucky to get monies every year. So we're hoping to send out the notice of award, notice of funding opportunity right now. And that would be available in Grant Solutions and grants.gov, but hasn't been quite posted yet, so. Okay, these are the preservation projects, and they are from $75,000 to $500,000. And obviously it's to preserve the historic site and includes historic districts, buildings, sites, structures, and objects. Eligible costs include studies, architectural plans, structure reports, and repair of properties according to the Secretary of Interior standards. As Dan was mentioning, there are a lot of federal requirements, and that's why if you get a good grant administrator, they can help you through all those quagmires. We have the Secretary of Interior standards that the project needs to meet. It also has to comply with our HPF, the Historic Preservation Fund Manual. So there's certain limitations on the way funding can be spent. And that includes both match and the grant amount. They also must comply with Section 106, NEPA, and then and this is a sticky part, is that they must enter into a preservation covenant or agreement with the state or other historic agency that can hold that covenant, promising to preserve the building and take care of it through a certain amount of time. And that depends on the amount of money that the grant is for. Usually it's about, I get this mixed up because SAT is longer, but it's usually about 20 years, 25. The properties, of course, must be listed in the National Register for Historic Preservation, historic places, or designated an historic landmark. If they're a contributing building to a National Register or historic district, then that's eligible property. Projects that are not listed on the National Register or in association with civil rights must include a nomination or amendment. So if the SHPO determines that it's a historic, a National Historic Register property, but it wasn't nominated because of the civil right issue, then you would need to amend it by including a nomination for that, for civil rights. The history projects are 15 to 50,000, and they include survey, planning, and documentation of historic sites and events. So you could do a survey, a survey project, or you can do like an exhibit project. I believe Dan was talking about exhibits. That would be part of the interpretive and education component. You could do brochures, or you can be a little bit innovative in your history project. We've had lots of different projects, and I handle a lot of those, and they're really, it's amazing what people do with the small amount of grant money that they're given. We also like to see that they have innovative strategies, and creative projects have measurable results and include cross-generational engagement and promote and involve community civil rights resources, and include private partnerships, service models to the community. This is just a list of things that we don't fund. It's new construction, acquisition. After the grant, you're responsible for maintaining it. We don't pay for maintenance. Properties must not be moved or have been moved, or any kind of fundraising costs or pre-award costs generally aren't allowable. And you can't use the funds during the grant period to lobby. You can do that on your own funding, but not with the grant funding. And other federal funds, so like the SHPO wouldn't be able to give you money from the HPF fund, and then you get a civil rights grants at the same time. So that's basically all I have, because I thought maybe people might have questions. I did want to go over again what Dan said, and that's really important. There are so many rules and regulations and requirements, because you've got the federal cost CFR 200, which requires lots of different reporting and eligible costs for that and federal money. And then you also have the Historic Preservation Fund that there are certain eligible costs there's certain ineligible costs that we don't pay for. So like you couldn't be doing any kind of, other than a survey, archaeological excavations aren't allowed and that type of thing. So there's
Madeline, oh, sorry.
Okay.
We'll save questions till the end.
Okay. But yeah, lots of rules.
Well, thank you so much. So that is how to get money for African American civil rights historic sites. Now let's hear more about how to get your site designated on the African American Civil Rights Network. Portia.
Hi, everyone. Let me start sharing my screen.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to meet everyone. I think I've been on some calls with a few of you, but maybe not all of you. Let's share. Okay, let me see if I can get this started. Can we all see the presentation? Awesome.
Yes.
Okay, so my name is Portia Dossi. I work in the Park History Program, and my chief responsibility is to serve as program historian or manager for the African American Civil Rights Network. So I support our national coordinator, Dr. Kelly Spradley-Karowski, and we are a very small but mighty team that has been a part of the network since its inception. So a little bit about the network and how it came to be. It was through an act of Congress, and we were signed into law by the president in 2018. The purpose of the network is to establish a commemorative program that honors the people, places, and events of the modern civil rights movement. Now there's a little bit of a caveat that we're going to get into, but it's actually a good thing because now sites such as the one Dan talked about can be a part of the network, even though it doesn't fall between the 1939 to 1968 time frame, but we will get into that. So some of our key values. This is not a part of the legislation, but this is kind of how Kelly and I are thinking about stewarding the program. So we want it to be national in scope. The civil rights movement happened not just in Alabama and Mississippi, it happened in my home state of Florida, it happened in Oregon, it happened in Rhode Island, New York State, et cetera, et cetera. We want that geographic diversity to be at the forefront of the sites we include in the network. Inclusive, emphasize the contributions of women and youth. So Black women in particular served as bridge leaders, both at the local and state levels. Young people were obviously very involved in the civil rights movement. You have the Black campus movement across the nation. We also want to be mindful of the contributions of the queer community. You have Bayard Rustin, who was the architect of the March on Washington in 1963, as well as Polly Murray and her legislative career. So we also want that to be included in our, in the sites that we include, sorry. Relevant, so this idea that a lot of commemorative programs are like, all right, we won, woo, civil rights, we triumphed, when obviously social unrest this year has proved otherwise. So we wanna make sure that while these events that have happened in the past are recognized, that we connect them to what's happening today to kind of bridge between history and the present. So criteria, probably asking like, well, how do I get on this network? So we need a verifiable connection to the civil rights movement. An example I like to use is maybe your grandmother said MLK stayed at her house in 1961. That's cool, it's a great story. But was your grandmother's home an organizing space? Did folks go there and develop strategy? If not, then we probably cannot connect you all to the network. So another thing that is very important is if it's a property, it needs to be listed or eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. We will get into that later. If it's a property, we would like owner permission. And if it's a National Park Service unit or program, that is those are the only types that are required to connect to the legislation's 1939 to 1968 timeframe. Recently, in May of this year, it was determined that applications coming from the public do not need to adhere to that timeframe. And so if you are relevant to civil rights history from 1619 to 2020, you can now apply for the network, as long as it has something to do with the Black freedom struggle. So National Register eligibility. So if you are a property and you are on the National Register, great. You just need to give us your document information. If you are not, we need you to determine that eligibility with your SHPO. And so we have a determination of eligibility form on our website. The SHPO will help you fill that out. And if they determine it's eligible, just send that to us. If you are not eligible, unfortunately, your property would not be able to apply for the network. So I've spent a lot of time talking about properties, but the network is not actually property specific. We have 3 defining resources: properties, facilities, and programs. So properties, obviously the physical location of an event or pattern of events; a facility, a museum, an archive that interprets or collects the history of those events or people; and program. So program is kind of the most nebulous. So it can be an interpretive dance, a tour, a curriculum, a website. And we get this question a lot, which is, can my resource be all 3? And the answer is yes. So a good example of that is the Lorraine Motel in Tennessee. So it is a property, it's on the register, it's a facility, it's obviously a museum, the National Civil Rights Museum, and it's a program because of the ongoing, programs and exhibits that they have on site. So you can be all three, you can be two, or you can just be one. We all are welcome. So this just talks a bit about kind of the sites we already have. So I will not spend too much time on this. I want us to get to questions pretty soon. But these are some of the sites that are already, or resources, that are already on the network. So some of our properties are the 16th Street Baptist Church, A.P. Thoreau Home, Medgar and Murley Evers Home, which is now a national monument, and I believe the 422nd National Park Service Unit, Mary McLeod Bethune, Central High School, and the Shelley House in Missouri. Altogether, we have 32 resources, which are, again, properties, facilities, and programs. Recently added was the John Hope Franklin Reconciliation Park in Tulsa, which is connected to the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. In my home state of Florida, we have the James Weldon Johnson Park, which is the site of the Axe Handle Sunday, which was a terrible event where peaceful protesters were beaten nearly to death by axe handles and baseball bats. So we don't shy away from some of the darker aspects of the civil rights movement. It's very important for us to tell a more comprehensive narrative of the civil rights movement, not one just of triumphs, but also the reality of what many folks went through during that time period. These are some of our programs. Our first ever resource added to the network was the Mitchell Jamison mural, which if you've ever been to the main interior building here in DC and you decide to get lunch at the Bison Bistro, you will have passed it. There's a number of murals in the building that are very beautiful. This one depicts Marian Anderson's 1939 performance after she was denied the right to perform at Constitution Hall. Eleanor Roosevelt, the NAACP, and other groups and people allowed her to perform at the Lincoln Memorial to an integrated crowd of nearly 75,000, I think. So this is what the mural memorializes. So you may be asking, what are the benefits of being part of the African American Civil Rights Network? So national recognition for your property, facility, or program. So there are other commemorative programs that are a little bit more competitive. This is not a competitive program. If we receive 1,000 applications in the calendar year, if all of them meet the criteria, they will be placed on the network. You also get to use our program's logo. So that first slide that opened up my presentation, that is our logo of a young Black girl climbing up the steps with the American flag behind her. So we like that. That creates a kind of branding. So you would be welcome to use your logo in any of your promotional materials, as well as our website would link to your website or any of the content you have digitally. And lastly, we help with technical assistance for the grants that Madeline talked about. So this is an ongoing partnership our office is having with Steel Pig, and we're still kind of working out the kinks, but Kelly, myself, or one of our fellows would assist in the application process if necessary. So am I good on time? Would I have time to kind of go through the application briefly?
Yep, a couple more minutes and then we'll take questions.
Great. So I may have to share my screen again, new share. Let me see. I think, sorry. Okay, can you all see the application and instructions page?
We still see the PowerPoint, which has that picture of the application.
Oh no, okay, so let me try this one more time. We're gonna try screen sharing again. And for some reason it's not, oh, right here, great. So this is on our website, which breaks down exactly how to apply for the network. We even have sample applications for folks to use, which I will actually open up a sample application for a property so we can kind of see what that looks like. So this is for the A.P. Thoreau House. This was actually added through a secretarial proclamation. So the public application process is not the only way to be added to the network. You can be added via secretarial proclamation, public application process, or a act of Congress, which is I believe how John Hope Franklin and the Kennedy King National Commemorative Site came to us. But we believe the public application process is probably the most democratic way and the way we're going to get the most kind of comprehensive overview of the civil rights movement. So on the application, we'll just need the date, if you're a property, facility, program, or all three, and the address, as well as your web address, your hours of operation. So if you are open to the public, we would like that information. If you're not open to the public, please include that information as well, because this is what will be on our website and how we will direct folks to your websites. This is where folks tend to run into trouble. So here you have, is this listed on the National Register? In this case, yes. We don't really need any more information after that, but the summaries is kind of the make or break. So the review process is Kelly and I do kind of a frontline review, and then it goes off to committee, where two committee members will look at your application, say yay or nay. If they both say yes or they both say no, that's it. If there is a yes and a no, we will serve as tiebreakers. So the summary is really important because this is where we're going to see your verifiable connection to the civil rights movement. Here, A.P. Turow was really significant because he served as legal counsel for the NAACP and helped to integrate New Orleans public school system. So that information is really all we need here. Now, there's a more detailed summary on the second page, and this is where we're trying to kind of understand in more detail exactly what all of that means and how it connects to the larger civil rights movement. And so it goes into detail about those specific cases, as well as his other life's work. And we recommend folks include kind of supplemental information as well, like photographs, newspaper documents, etc. But we still would like all of that information to be conveyed within the 1,200 word limit, because that is what the committee is looking for. We also provide assistance with this part of the application. So if you want to draft the summaries first and then send that to myself or Kelly, we will kind of help you work out the bugs, and then you can more officially submit once you finalize the summaries. The turnaround for the reviews really depends on the, or turnaround for the applications, excuse me, really depends on the amount we've gotten, as well as the folks above us, the Department of Interior, and their schedule. So I'd like to say that we typically take several months, but this past year with the coronavirus and other things going on, it's taken a little bit longer than our 12-week typical turnaround. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I believe that's it for me, and I am happy to answer questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Portia. That was great. So does anyone have questions for Madeline, for Portia, for Dan? And just go ahead. You can either raise your hand or just shout it out.
Sure. This is Annie Harris. I have a question, I guess, for Portia and Madeline. I know the emphasis for the program seems to be primarily on the civil rights period, but both of you mentioned that you could actually go back to 1619. And I work in the region north of Boston, and we've done some recent work in trying to do more interpretation around the triangle trade and northern slavery, and it sounds like that would fit if we wanted to apply for some program funding. Is that true?
Yeah, well, previously in the last few years, the funding for the HPF, for the civil rights grants, was limited to the civil rights era. But in this round of funding in we're opening it up so it is a little bit more broad. So you could go back. Anything that leads to, anything that is relevant to establishing civil rights should be okay.
So that's, oh, sorry. I have a
question.
Civil Rights Network.
I have a question. Hello.
Yep, go ahead.
What is the amount of the grants and what years?
Well, for preservation projects, which are construction projects on buildings, construction and repair,
Uh-huh.
It's 75,000 to 500,000.
Okay. Programming dollars?
Programming dollars?
Yeah, you said that's for capital, correct?
That's for construction. For history projects, which would be exhibits or oral histories or surveys, that's up until $50,000.
Okay.
Now,
And
you match
what is your website again, where I get the applications?
for which?
Both.
Well, the grant funding gets posted on grants.gov and Grant Solutions, but we haven't posted it yet for 2020 funding. But that should be happening quite soon.
So if I go to grants.gov, I should put in U.S. African American Civil Rights?
African American civil rights, yeah. I believe the CFDA is 15.94.
Okay.
And for the Civil Rights Network, I've placed the link in the chat box.
Okay, it popped up so quick. Okay, thank you.
I put the grant link in the chat too.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
I've got a question.
Go ahead.
George Collins here in Baltimore with the African American Firefighters Historical Society. You all mentioned the historic designation of the property or being listed on the historic registry. But does it have that registry, does it have to be related to civil rights, or just could it be on the registry? I'm a little.
Well, for the grant, it has to be in the national. I don't think that's new.
I couldn't hear you.
Remember
You're
to,
breaking up.
yeah, remember to mute if you're not speaking so we don't have other background sound.
Okay, for the grants, I'm sorry, I lost the train of thought of the question.
For being
Does it
listed.
have to be civil rights properties? I think he was asking.
It has to be in the it has to be listed in the National Register. Now, if something important happened on that property and it's listed in the National Register for another reason, maybe the architect, or like a church that had a special architect and it got listed in like 1970 for that, you can still apply and show what the significance is of the civil rights movement or prior. And then if you did get a grant, you would be expected to amend, go through and try to amend the nomination. And that would be required to include the significance that you're now talking about.
Now, if our building is in Baltimore Orchard Street Church, and it is listed on the historical register, but am I hearing that it does not have to be listed as part of the civil rights, even though that is part of the history of the Orchard Street Church?
That's correct. But you would have to prove the significant events that occurred there, and then you would have to submit a new nomination to amend that nomination, the original nomination that it was listed for in the National Register.
And what designation would that be?
Well, that would be determined on what your significant event or person
To civil rights.
in civil rights, or
Okay.
leading up to civil rights.
Okay.
I think that's what you're asking.
And
Yeah.
for the network, as long as it's listed on the National Register, that listing does not need to mention anything related to civil rights. However, in your application, you must connect your site to the civil rights movement. So an example
Okay.
is we have a site that's interested in applying. So they're listed for architectural significance. However, Martin Luther King Jr., MLK, and other leading figures in the 1950s and 60s traveled to that historic district to deliver talks and help organize. So that's what.
That's what I'm confused about, because over the years, it's been used by the abolitionists,
Mm-hmm.
and it's also been a stop for President Roosevelt came, and other notables, W.B. Du Bois, many community projects done by his wife. So all those things occurred out of Orchard Street. So would that fit?
Yes, so that would be a wonderful fit for our network, and as long as that's in the application, that the listing wouldn't be an issue.
And I think Shantae Daniels will definitely, who invited you to the call, will definitely help you with that as well.
Okay, thank you.
So the Heritage Area can be the conduit to help you make those connections.
Katie, I have a question for Portia. Portia, I think this happened during COVID. So I'm pretty sure that the secretary issued a proclamation to make the 1908 race riot in Springfield a site. So here's my follow-up question. We as the Heritage Area are working through a grant that we got through the Civil Rights Network to create a program that's going to be virtual and all sorts of interesting things. So here's my question. Would we then, after it was done and finished and everything, be able to apply for that to become part of the network as a separate program?
Yes, you absolutely would be able to do that. So the Springfield Race Riot site is considered a property, and so you all could apply as a program.
Okay.
So yeah,
I thought that's what you said, and I just wanted to affirm that that's what we could do.
Yes.
Okay.
Great. Looking forward to your application.
It'll be a while, but yeah, I'll log this away for the future.
Thanks.
Do we have more questions?
So I have a question for Dan. This is Annie Harris. You are the pass-through for these two grants, as I understand it. What happens if they don't do the forms? They don't fill it out properly. What is how will it take all the risk for it? I mean, how are you managing that? I assume you also don't get paid anything for it. You were just doing this to promote the project. How are you thinking about that?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One is that, yeah, all of that passes back through me. I actually am responsible for submitting that back to the grants administrator. And secondly, we did build in an indirect 10% de minimis into the grant. So if I do incur additional administrative time that's specifically related to this, I can actually chalk that up to indirect costs. So either way, but I have to scrutinize, I have to make sure that what they're sending back to me meets all the criteria, and then I double check and triple check before I submit it, make sure that it's correct. But yeah, because I'm still the grantee in the eyes of the National Park Service, so I'm still responsible.
Okay.
Any other questions? It says Chris Bacon. Go ahead.
Everybody. So my question is, I think I might have two. If there is a museum that focuses on the history, so it would be a program, but the site isn't on the National Register because it's a new construction, does that qualify for either the network or the grant?
So I can only speak for the network. So you're saying that it's actively a museum currently?
Yes.
And that museum has a physical location, but it's not on the National Register.
Well, actually, so in our case, our building is, but our building is on the register for reasons that are not related to the civil rights movement.
Okay.
We just happen to be in a historic building, unrelated to civil rights, right? So
I see. Okay, so you all could apply as a facility and just list that your location is on the network.
Okay.
And then, but you have civil rights programming?
So Underground Railroad.
Okay. Oh, so yeah, we would include that as part of the Civil Rights Network. So facility, my recommendation is to come in as a facility and program, and then list that the building where you all reside is on the National Register.
Okay.
And for the grants, again, as long as your building is listed in the National Register, you could get a construction grant if there was an issue. But if it's just a history grant and you wanted to do an exhibit, our grants are supposed to be place-based. So as long as you're doing something that's related to a place, then you could do an exhibit. Even if your building wasn't in the National Register, you could apply for a grant.
Okay.
To
And
do
then so go ahead.
No,
A
to
question for Dan separately, unrelated to this, is why strategically, why if the CCR did acquire 501c3 status at some point, why did you guys decide that they wouldn't just apply directly for the grant? Why did the National Heritage Area act as the fiscal sponsor?
They could have. Primarily, though, we had the administrative capacity to be able to deal with that at that time. You know, now a couple of years later on, they probably would have that capacity themselves.
It's a very time-consuming process to, especially when you're dealing with a construction project, to make sure you're doing the federal requirements properly. So it's a lot of time.
Thank you, everybody.
So are there any other questions? Also, we can, I'll share everyone's email addresses, and if there's specific questions, you can follow up on the side. But any other questions for the greater good before we wrap up? I want to thank all our speakers today. This was really excellent. I'm excited too. I didn't even realize, Madeline, your grants were opening up soon. So very timely as well. And in November, Thursday, November 19th at 2 o'clock, we will hear from the National Battlefield Program, and their grants will also be opening up in November with a deadline of January. So they really want heritage areas to come and hear about how you can apply for a battlefield grant. It doesn't have to just be battlefield property, kind of like the discussion today, influential sites that relate to battles. And
Katie, is that a new thing? Influential sites related to battles?
It may be.
Because we're trying to.
In November, and then you'll know.
I'm going to tune in November, although I think it's.
But it's not completely new. I think they're just trying to bring that more to the forefront to let people know you don't have to own a battlefield property to apply for the program.
But we're trying to save, we're actually involved in saving and acquiring as a new headquarters for us, a site that's both an Underground Railroad documented site and a Civil War skirmish site just before Gettysburg, but it's not on the official list of battlefields. And so every time I've looked online for that program, it always indicates that that would not be eligible for an acquisition grant because it's not a.
Yeah, the acquisition grants, sorry, I'm going back to my previous position. So the acquisition grants, the properties eligible for those grants do have to be listed in that report for referencing.
They do.
Yeah, but the other grants that will be the main focus of the best practices next month are for the planning grants, which are those broader ones that relate to survey, mapping, preservation planning, you know.
Not design of facilities.
We'll have to find out in November.
Yeah, okay. You'll have to find out because there might be interp design, but not necessarily like interior architectural design. But I'll let Emily from Battlefields describe that.
Okay.
And then in December, Liz is going to lead a conversation about filling out our National Heritage Area annual data collection forms, which is really important for our 6 new heritage areas, but also important for new staff, new executive directors doing that kind of work, or for people who just want to feel like they're doing it right or doing it better. And we'll hear from heritage areas who think they have really good strategies. So if you are one of those heritage areas that thinks you have great strategies, reach out to Heather Wickens or myself, and we look forward to working more with you. The New Year call in January will be on like New Year, new programs, how we're adjusting to our current state of affairs. So thanks everyone for joining. Thank you to our speakers, and look forward to seeing you more in the future. Thanks so much.
Thank you.